There's a lot of stories in a bottle of whiskey. And no good story ever started with a salad.
John is Sault Ste. Marie's Wandering Whisky Whisperer, which first of all, I need to know what a whiskey whisperer is.
Well, Jasmyn, that's a really good question. A whiskey whisperer is someone who makes a deep connection with whiskey, similar to a horse whisperer or a dog whisperer.
And how does one become a whiskey whisperer? What was your journey to become that?
In 2015, I had a sabbatical where I got to teach in Scotland. And while I was in Scotland, I met one of the teachers at the Scottish School of Forestry was whiskey nobility, and he took me under his tutelage, and together we visited a lot of distilleries, and then he just realized that I had this real passion for whiskey. Another fella by the name of Ted Wilson came up to guest lecture, and he was a very interesting person, and we ended up going up the coast of Scotland, and we're in the Dornoch Castle whiskey bar. It's the best whiskey bar in the world. They won all these awards. Big fireplace, and he says, "You're the whiskey whisperer." So I looked it up online, and oh darn, there was somebody that was already a whiskey whisperer. So I thought, nobody is the wandering whiskey whisperer. So I go all over the place whispering whiskey.
And you were really learning from some of the best and most rich places with whiskey history on your sabbatical.
Yes, I ended up visiting 17 distilleries and sampling and taking notes of 74 different expressions while I was there.
And have you always liked whiskey? Is that something that you have always drank throughout your life or enjoyed here and there?
Yes, I've had a long history with whiskey. It started in earnest, especially Scotch whiskey, when a friend of mine was doing his PhD in the University of Edinburgh, and he came back at Christmas and he brought some really good whiskey. And then later on I had another friend who, for a New Year's party, a New Year's Eve party, we decided to get a bunch of different single malts and have a tasting. And ever since then, I've just been fascinated by the complexity, and that's basically my journey.
What are some of the things that you look for in a good whiskey? What makes a good whiskey?
I really like the complexity. Starts with looking at the legs in a glass. And
what are the legs?
The legs are when you swirl it around, and it's how the whiskey comes down the side of the glass. Glass is very important for whiskey drinking and tasting, and the thicker the legs, the more viscous, the more complex the whiskey is. I look at that, I look at the color, I look to see how much of the color comes from oak or comes from the coloring. Every whiskey has a different color. Then the nose. The nose is something that is just amazing. There's some whiskeys that I could nose all day, just hook a cup up and just walk around, you know, with this whiskey. Oh, the smell is just delightful. And then there's the taste. And I like to do just a very simple 15 ml pour, and I do 3 sips, 5 ml each. And first sip, second sip, and the third sip has 1 drop of water. And I find that I don't really drink whiskey, I just taste it. And then when you're doing that, you have a deep respect for the craftsmanship of the master distiller. Some of the whiskeys are 20 years old, 30 years old. I've had a 40-year-old whiskey. That means it's been in an oak barrel waiting for someone to taste it for 40 years. And it's that moment, and when you have reverence for that moment, the whiskey begins to, I don't know, it's kind of whimsical wisdom appears from the whiskey. If you're in tune with that and you appreciate the whiskey and you respect it.
The tasting sounds very scientific, like 5 milliliter tastes and then the drop of water. Like you have this down to a science.
I have a Bachelor of Science in Forestry, and I am a bit of a scientist and a whiskey aficionado at the same time. Yes.
What are some of your favorite whiskeys? Like if you had to pick one that's your absolute favorite.
If budget wasn't a concern, it would be the Highland Park 25. Highland Park 25 is, I've been to the Highland Park Distillery in the Orkneys, and oh, it's just...
And what about that one do you like? It just has all the elements, the nose, the taste, all of it together?
The balance of the flavors, that whiskey is 25 years old, and they've taken their absolute best whiskey and they put it in barrels for 25 years. Like if you get a 25-year-old whiskey and you have it for 10 years, it doesn't become a 35-year-old whiskey. It will always be a 25-year-old. And that is just as close to perfection that I found from a Scotch whiskey from Scotland. There's one other whiskey that I do really like, and that is the Laird of Fintry. And that is from the Okanagan Craft Distilleries in BC. And they have a lottery. They produce 1,000 bottles a year, and they have a lottery. There's about 9,000 people on their mailing list. And my neighbor got a bottle, and he introduced that to me. So I think that the Laird of Fintry is my number one, and I haven't had a battle between it and the Highland Park 25, because the Highland Park 25 is about $900 a bottle.
Oh, okay.
So I just haven't had a chance to
Don't
get there
get
yet.
over your 15 milliliter per glass of that.
Well, that's part of it. That's part of it.
Does whiskey have to be expensive to be good?
No. Great question. There is some whiskeys that are single malts that are in the, under $50. Some of the Canadian whiskeys are around $50, the older ones that are just beautiful. So whiskey, the price doesn't really factor into it. An Aberlour 12 is $64. An Aberlour 18 is about $150, and I prefer the Aberlour 12.
So it's not always about price.
It's not always about price. It's about, and it's not what I might like in a whiskey, you might not like, because our taste buds are so complex that we just, everybody has a different whiskey, and I'm always in search of the perfect dram, and so that's what keeps me ticking, or that's what motivates me to try these whiskeys. And
you have a new book,
yes.
The Musings of the Wandering Whisky Whisperer.
I do.
You share a lot of knowledge in that book. What can people learn about whiskey from your book?
Well, my book is changing the way people look at whiskey and do whiskey. First of all, the very first musing that I have that came from whiskey whispering is respect. If you don't respect whiskey, whiskey will disrespect you twice as bad. And we've all had times, if you're on this path, where you might have got a little carried away with some of the whiskeys that you've had and tasted, and you always pay the price for that. So respect is one of the things. I take people on a bit of a journey. I don't want to reveal too much, but there's a maturation, there's a fascination with how whiskey, which comes out of the distiller, out of the line arm on the still, and it's just clear like vodka. And then this aging process puts the color, the brown and the golds back into it. And I'm always, being a forester, I'm always fascinated by the interaction of the wood and the whiskey and the spirit.
And what's next for the Whiskey Wanderer, or Whisperer?
Well, what
Whiskey Whisperer.
I'm heading out. After having the Laird of Fintry, I contacted the president of the Okanagan Craft Spirits Distillery, and I'm heading out there in May to do a whispering master class, as well as a really nice tasting. He's going to bring out some of the ones from his family reserve, and so that's going to be an event out there. I'll do a BC book launch while I'm there. I might head up to Hearst. There's a guy making whiskey in Hearst, and I want to check that out, and some of my buddies want to do a little road trip, so we might have a wee wander up to Hearst. there's a bunch of distilleries in Nova Scotia. I guess the government has made it easier for craft distilleries to get into. So I might look at contacting some of those and seeing if they want to meet me and do a book launch.
So a lot of wandering in your future. A lot of wandering and whiskey coming your way. Okay, great. Well, I can't partake in the tasting today, but I'm sure we could convince my camera people to have a little sip with
they
you.
might like
and
that.
you could share some of your knowledge during a tasting.
Absolutely, and
Great.
then we could see how the whispering process unfolds.
Perfect.